Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. First, we're going to talk about Avdiivka because we continue receiving significant number of updates and details about the clashes in the stronghold and in the area around. And the most important update is that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed the complete control over the stronghold. I expected that the Russians would announce this few days later, or let's say during the next day or something like this, after the end of clearing operation, after the capturing every single Ukrainian soldier that were abandoned or blocking the city. But the Russians took a decision to do this night. So, according to a short report from the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians during the previous days, during the previous, let's say, last days of clashes during the retreat and withdrawal process, lost more than 1,500 soldiers. The Russians managed to establish control over additional 32 square kilometers, and that the situation for the Ukrainians was critical, and the order that Syrsky gave to the Ukrainian soldiers to abandon their positions was made after a day of uncontrolled withdrawing of positions by the Ukrainian forces. So this is a short, let's say, report of Ministry of Defense, and now let's go to the situation on the ground because we continue receiving updates. During the previous night, we continue to receive significant number of updates with the prisoners of war, and obviously during the next few days we're going to continue to receive them more because there are still a lot of Ukrainians who were blocked and abandoned in Avdiivka. For example, according to some report, the Russians during the previous night managed to, let's say, not during the previous night, but during the previous few days, managed to capture more than 500 Ukrainian soldiers. And this number we received by the end of the previous day. So obviously the next few days we're going to receive more and more updates about the situation. Furthermore, according to some sources, we got some updates and reports and confirmations about further Russian offensive operation along 0542 road in direction of Lastachkina. During the previous night and during the previous evening and this morning there were very heavy clashes. The Russians were trying to storm the area to increase the foothold and to force the Ukrainians to step back further, while the Russians see some disorganization in Ukrainian military orders, and as a result of those clashes the Russians managed to enter Lastachkina and to establish control over the eastern part of the village. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that, but the other Russian sources published very, let's say, interesting video of artillery duels. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian forces who were abandoning their positions and moving in direction of Lastachkina, Orlyanka, Severne. As you can see, the Ukrainians from their side were trying to attack the Russians. The Russian offensive forces trying to slow them down, and of course, as a result of those attacks, very likely that some Ukrainian soldiers were also attacked. So there was lots of cases of friendly fire. Yes, we need to understand that the Ukrainians had also significant losses during the friendly fire when the main forces were abandoning their positions, because there was like a real disorganization, and sometimes the Ukrainians didn't understand who were moving in towards them, either enemies or friends or something like this. Furthermore, according to some sources, we have a confirmed report that some Ukrainians who were withdrawing and abandoning their positions from Lastachkina in direction of Orlyanka met a friendly fire from the Ukrainians who were taking and holding their positions inside of this area, inside of Orlyanka. As a result of that short battle, let's see, few tens of soldiers of Ukrainian armed forces were destroyed, so as a result of friendly fire. And now it's very good to understand, to once again, how the Russians managed to complete the battle for Avdiivka so fast and so successful. And you know that during the previous days, the situation, the things developed so fast, so sometimes we missed, at least I missed, the most important part and most important things that were obviously in front of my eyes. You know that the main reason of Russian victory was not just a well-planned offensive operation, smart attacks from using the pipeline, smart attacks in the Terikon and so on. Probably the 60% of, let's say, a reason of Russian attack, Russian victory, Russian success was complete superiority in the air. The Russians bombed and launched more than 500 air bombs on Avdiivka during the previous 3-4 days or something like this. And you know, today the Institute of Study of War made their own conclusions, and they're saying that for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians managed to establish complete air superiority and to suppress Ukraine air air defense systems. And they're saying that that was the real reason why the Russians were so successful, so aggressive, and so fast. And you know that regarding that, this is Institute of Study of War, I completely agree with them. The Russians managed to establish complete air defense, air superiority. They managed to suppress completely the Ukraine air defense. Just yesterday, on the 17th of February, we received for the first update since the beginning of Avdiivka offensive operation report that Ukrainians managed to shut down at least 3 airplanes, but the Russians later denied this information, saying that every single Su-34 returned to the base, and there was just one case with Su-35, but the Russians are saying that that Su-35 was destroyed as a result of Russian friendly fire. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Even if the Ukrainians managed to shut down the Russians' 3 airplanes, 3 bombers, they managed to do this just in the last day of clashes for Avdiivka, when everything was already resolved and when the destiny of the stronghold was already, let's say, ended, finished, and decided by the universe or something like this. And also, Institute of Study of War reports that if the Russians are able to save their air defense, air superiority in the future, then the situation, not just in Avdiivka, but all of the entire line of combat contact will develop faster, more aggressive from the Russian side. And this is very important and very dangerous conclusion that the Institute of Study of War made, according to Ukrainians. Furthermore, the Russians continue offensive operation in storming Pobeda. They also became more aggressive on this direction. During the previous night, we got additional 2 videos of bombings and clashes in this area. The Russians also used aviation and air bombs to suppress the Ukrainian positions in this area. And once again, on this direction, also see a complete absence of Ukrainian air defense. And this is the biggest problem, because the Russians have guided bombs, and now they can be more aggressive and they can start movement and start, let's say, attacks, very fast attack on every single direction, and not just, let's say, in Avdiivka. Imagine yourself what kind of defense belt of Ukraine armored forces of Ukraine can hold and can stand against 500 FABs per 3 days. It's impossible for any direction, neither for Orechov, Robotyne, neither for Kupiansk direction or Chasiv Yar. Every single city will be reduced to ruins and bypassed by the Russians if the Russians are able to establish complete air superiority. Furthermore, we are talking about just the, let's say, old Russian models like Su-34, Su-35, Su-30, but according to some sources, the Russians start using Su-57 in Ukraine, and this report we got from Kiev, according to information we have on the 7th of February, when during the, let's say, missile attacks on the 7th of February, the Russians used their new missile Ha-69, and this missile can be used just by Su-57. This is the, let's say, scene, this is the footage from the Ministry of Defense, let's say, office, and very likely that the Russians start using Su-57, which also improved the Russian positions in air superiority in Ukraine. So we see that as now we need to analyze, we need to follow, we need to understand how the entire air superiority will develop and increase the speed of the Russian armed forces on the territory of Ukraine. When talking about Robotyne, according to information we have, we start receiving updates yesterday that the Russians launched an offensive operation on this direction as well. And according to some sources, we have geolocations. The Russians established control over the southern stronghold right in front of the village itself. And this video we received yesterday. So this is, let's say, the progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation by the 17th of February of 2024. Very likely during the previous night, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and very likely the Russians managed to answer the village itself from the south and from the northwest. And once again, the Russians were bombing and attacking this area with aviation as well, and we'll see how fast the Russians are able to establish control over Robotyne. On this video, we might see how the Ukrainian Russian forces were moving on the armored personnel carrier to the north. Somewhere here, the carrier was damaged or destroyed. The Russians managed to land their infantry in this area, and after that, the clearing operation started. Different mappers confirms the further additional Russian progress further to the north, trying to cut where the Russians or some Russian squads and separate groups were trying to cut the Ukrainian positions in the Ukrainian supply road 0408 that goes to Rabotina itself. So a very interesting operation, but as I understand, according to reports and updates, Rabotina and Verbova are not the only cities and places the Russians have interests. Furthermore, according to information we have, we see some kind of intensifying of activity on Kamyanskaya direction. We continue receiving significant number of details, updates, geolocations, videos from this territory as well. On this video, we can see how the Russians were bombing Petykhatki itself. A little bit further to the northwest, we have the video of FPV drone strikes from the Russian forces of Ukrainian positions in this area. The Russians were trying to suppress FPV drone operators' positions in the village. And if we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of February, we're going to see that there is a really big activity of Russian forces on this direction. So very likely the Russians are planning to attack this territory from two directions. The first one direction Kamyanskaya, let's say Stepnogorsk, this is the first area of attack, and the second Russian attack is going to be Rabotina and Verbova. Currently we don't have enough of information to make a conclusion whether the Russians are planning to move in direction of Orekhov, but we'll see. As we discussed, the number of forces the Russians concentrated in this area is enough not just to establish control over Rabotina and let's say Petykhatki on Kamyansk on this area, but to move further in direction of Orekhov. And if we add to this situation also complete air superiority, then I must say that with air superiority and with 100 FAPs per day on one direction, the Russians will be able to reach maybe even Dnipro, because without air defense from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians have no chances to stop the Russians anywhere. Now we are moving further to Bakhmut Artyomov's direction. We have additional geolocations. The storm in this area continues. One geolocation from Klishevka. The Ukrainian soldiers were returning back from another special operation, a reconnaissance operation, but they were discovered by the Russian FPV drones and destroyed. Now we are moving further to Terny Liman direction. The Russian sources reported about further additional progress in direction of the village Zhiribets. The Russians managed to establish additional control over additional 100 kilometers or 500 meters. This information yesterday was confirmed by pro-Russian sources. Today this information was either confirmed by neutral mappers. So the movement of Russian forces continues, and they're getting closer and closer to the river. Kupiansk direction. During the previous night, the Russians bombed heavily with FAPs Kupiansk itself. As a result of let's say clashes, as a result of bombings, the Russians launched more than 10 FAPs per day, and we can see complete air superiority from the Russian side as well. 10 FAP per day, it's a lot. That's a lot. Of course, it's not hundreds of FAP like we used to see in Avdiivka, but the battle for Avdiivka has ended. The Russians managed to get a significant experience, and now the Russians probably will try to use this experience with massive use of aviation on all over the line of combat contact. And furthermore, don't forget that this year, according to information we have, now when talking about aviation, the Russians have currently just one problem. And the problem is the pilots and let's say pilots, that's it. So you need to have pilot and machine. I'm talking about Su-35 or Su-34 or Su-57. And according to information we have, by the end of this year, the Russians will start a massive production of Su-Охотник, the drone that doesn't need pilot. And if the Russians are able to start massive production of Охотник, then of course the Russians will establish complete air superiority, and the situation can start developing very fast in comparison with the current updates and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summer Channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.